Are you glad you came up tonight? Good. Oh, we got a great crowd tonight, Pastor. We do. Well, it's great to be with you. It's great to have the opportunity to share from the message from the Word tonight. My name is Pastor Ray Ramirez. I am typically with the worship team, but Pastor Chad likes to stretch us. And so he gives Pastor Mike and I the stretching opportunity to grow in our ministry and our calling. So thank you, Pastor Chad, for that. Amen. 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 I just want to say a quick welcome. I think she's up in the balcony. To my mother-in-law, Nancy Crutchmeyer, is visiting. I have to get some points here. I'm sorry. There she is. Hey, welcome. She's visiting. My children are in heaven because Grandma's here. So we're glad that she's with us for a month, actually. Thank the Lord that she's visiting. So welcome. If you're joining us tonight on King's Community Live, we're glad that you're with us. We have been amazed at the amount of people that have been joining us around the world and even in this country online from week to week, and we're blessed that you're with us tonight. If you're visiting from out of the country, welcome to Jerusalem. We have been in a series here that Pastor Chad began from the book of Joshua. And the title of the series was Never Been This Way, dealing with some of the things that the people of Israel faced in that next season as they walk with this new leader, Joshua, and enter into some new things that they had never faced before as they come into the land of Israel. And we're going to continue in that series tonight. We're going to continue in Joshua chapter 11. And I'll just quick anecdote here. You know, as we're going through the series, Pastor Chad, he gives us, the assignments of the weeks, but we don't necessarily know what chapter we're going to get until a little later. And you're kind of rooting, oh, come on, give me chapter 9. Oh, no. So I wasn't necessarily expecting chapter 11, but actually I think there is a powerful message in this text that we're going to look at tonight and explore. But before we get to the text, I just want you to do me a favor. I want you just to imagine something with me, because I think this is going to set the stage for what we're going to look at tonight. If you just kind of, in your mind, close your eyes for a minute. I want you to imagine this, okay? I want you to imagine a large modern city, bustling with about 40,000 residents. It's active in trade and tourism. It's a secure place. It has a large police force, and it has the latest weapons and technology and training. And it's a city with over 800 years of history, of people building and developing and making something. Can you imagine this? You see this city in your mind. You see something in our world, you would see a modern city. And that's the context of the beginning of the text that was the city of, in English we say, if we're good Americans, we say Hazor. In Hebrew, the word is Chatzur. It begins with a chet, Chatzur. And that's the context where we're going to pick up in Joshua chapter 11 tonight, is the city of Chatzur, the city of Hazor. And if you remember last week, Pastor Chad mentioned that at this time in the history of Israel, the land was made up of city-states. It wasn't like large kingdoms. Egypt was a dominant kingdom, but around this part of the world, it was made up of different city-states. And this particular one, Chatzur, was a prominent one, and we're going to look at this. So I want to make it first. I just found this very interesting. So I want to read you a little bit. How many people have been to the site of this ancient city? Yes? Okay. It's quite an interesting history. It's available. It's an archaeological park. You can go. It's a national park of Israel. But let me just read you a little bit first, some background on the city. Chatzur was first identified with biblical Hazor Chatzur by J.L. Porter in 1875. In 1928, the British archaeologist J. Garstang conducted a limited excavation at the site, and then large-scale excavations were conducted at the site during 1955 through 58 and 1968 through 69 by a team led by the late Yigael Yadin. This city, Chatzur, was by far the largest city in ancient Canaan. It was 200 acres in size, which compared to Megiddo was 14 acres and Jericho at 8 acres. It's huge. and one of the most important Canaanite city-states before Joshua's destruction of the day. Estimates set the population at its height at over 40,000 people. Hatzor's location was strategic both economically and militarily. Located roughly 10 miles north of the Sea of Galilee and 5 miles southwest of Lake Hula, it overlooked the Via Maris, the major overland trade route from Egypt to the north and east, which crossed the Jordan on the way to Damascus. Hatzor dominated the Hula Basin and thus became a major trading center. Hatzor's view of the Hula Valley also made it a critical defense point against armies invading from the north. Hatzor is mentioned extensively in both Egyptian and Mesopotamian records in conjunction with the other major trading cities of the day. Documents written for Mari were written about 1850 BC, mentioned Hatzor as a major commercial center involved in the vital tin trade used in making bronze. Egyptian sources often refer to Hatzor starting with its first appearance in the execration texts in 2000 to 1800 BC down to the reign of Seti I. We're extremely well informed. Yeah, you got me? Okay. During the 1300s, when the city reached its zenith, the Amarna text mentions Hatzor's king, Abdi-Tishri. Few Canaanite rulers used the title king during this period, which is another indication of Hatzor's importance. The size and location of this city, as well as references to it in other ancient literature, indicate that this city probably controlled a vast portion of Canaan. So that sets the stage tonight for where we're going to pick up. This is an influential metropolis in our world today. Trade, money, security. And this is where this kingdom interacts and begins to interact with the God of the Bible as Joshua and the people. So let's go to our text tonight, Joshua chapter 11. And we're going to begin reading in verse 1, read all the way down to verse 15. And it says this: When Jabin, king of Hatzor, heard this news, he sent a message to Jobab, king of Madon, the kings of Shimron and Ashkaf, and the kings of the north and the hill country, the Arava south of Kinneret, the Judean foothills and the slopes of Dor to the west, the Canaanites in the east and west, the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites in the hill country, and the Hivites at the foot of Hermon in the land of Mitzpah. They went out with all of their armies, a multitude as numerous as the sand on the seashore, along with a vast number of horses and chariots. All these kings joined forces. They came together and camped at the waters of Merom to attack Israel. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, for at this time tomorrow I will cause all of them to be killed before Israel. You are to hamstring their horses and burn up their chariots." So Joshua and his surprised them at the waters of Merom and attacked them. The Lord handed them over to Israel and struck them down, pursuing them as far as Great Sidon and Mishrepoth Marim, to the east as far as the valley of Mitzpeh. They struck them down, leaving no survivors. Joshua treated them as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses and burned up their chariots. At the time Joshua turned back, captured Hatzor, and struck down its king with a sword, because Hatzor had formerly been the leader of all these kingdoms. They struck down everyone in it with the sword, completely destroying them. He left no one alive, and then he burned down Hatzor. Joshua captured all these kings in their cities and struck them down with the sword. He completely destroyed them as Moses, the Lord's servant, had commanded. However, Israel did not burn any of the cities that stood on their mounds except Hatzor, which Joshua burned. The Israelites plundered all the spoils and cattle of these cities for themselves, but they struck down every person with the sword until they had annihilated them, leaving no one alive. Just as the Lord had commanded his servant Moses, Moses commanded Joshua. That is what Joshua did, leaving nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. Father, tonight we thank you that these words are preserved for us, that these words and stories have been passed down through generation to generation to be a reminder, to be a warning, to be a challenge, to be a teacher for us. And I just pray tonight as we review these words, as we look at this story, Lord, would you reveal your truth to our hearts? Would you speak to us by your Spirit? We ask it in the name of Yeshua. Amen. Amen. So you read through this text and you say, what a happy story. Right? Wow. Annihilation, destruction. It's a challenging, when I first read through the text, I was like, wow, where do I go? And it's a challenging text, but I think God, again, there has some very, very profound things for us in this story. And I want to begin just going back to the first verse here, when it says, when Jabin, king of Hatzor, heard this news, he sent a message. What did he hear? For that, we have to go back to the chapter before that Pastor Chad was in last week in chapter 10. And it's in chapter 10, verse 40. It says this, so Joshua conquered the whole region, the hill countries, the Negev, the Judean foothills, and the slopes with all their kings, leaving no survivors. Then Joshua returned with all Israel to the camp at Gilgal. So what did he hear? Well, first he heard that he had conquered and that he left no survivors. So I think for a leader and for a king, this tells you a few things. This is not a man who's interested in compromise. This is not a kingdom that is looking to come and take people into, to take them out of their land as other civilizations had done throughout history and taking them into captivity. This is a group of people that are coming in and leaving nothing left, which I believe puts fear in the heart of this king and the kings around him. He also heard that Joshua returned to the camp at Gilgal and saw this as a strategic advantage. I think he saw that they had returned back to camp and thought, they're taking a rest. Now's our opportunity. This is a strategic advantage. Let me rally the troops. We'll jump on this and we'll have the victory. That's what he heard. So he sends a message to these other rulers under his influence. And this was not, hey, how you doing? Haven't heard from you guys in a while. Hope everything's going well. This is, hey, it's time. You're under my authority, under my control. You need to send your forces. We need to deal with this. And that's what happens. He sends this message out, and they gather all of their armies together in this valley. Let me just make a couple little points here. What do we see represented in this city? I see three things. First, wealth and influence. We know they were on a trade route. They didn't need money. They had wealth. They had enough wealth to have a lot of horses and chariots. He had enough influence to basically tell these other kings under his authority, in a way, to say, you better show up, and they did. So he had influence. So we see wealth and influence. We see security and strategic importance. I believe this King Jabin saw himself as the last stand to the people of Israel. He saw that he conquered the southern parts of this land, and he said, I am the thing standing in the way of these people running this entire country. I'm the last stand. He's not saying, I'm bored. Don't have anything else to do. Let's go mess with these people that are showing up on our doorstep. He has an intention. We see power and military might. It says this in verse 4 of this chapter 11. They went out with all their armies as a multitude as numerous as the sands of the seashore, along with a vast number of horses and chariots. These people had advanced weapons of the day. In fact, we don't see mention of chariots in the book of Joshua until here. The last time you saw chariots involved in battle was Egypt. So this is new. If you remember, Pastor Chad brought last week, I thought it was wonderful. He said, was it last week you preached on the second wave? 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. The second wave. Joshua and the people of Israel, they defeat Ai, and they think, this is good. We've had this victory. And Pastor Chad was preaching, the second wave is coming. This second wave that was about to come before the people of Israel was not something they had faced yet since they left Egypt. Chariots were weapons used for offensive attack. They weren't defensive. And these kingdoms had them because they had great wealth and they wanted to protect it. It's interesting that one scholar said that the choice for the battle was along the valley because it gave the advantage to these armies with the chariots because it was flat. They needed a flat place to throw the offensive. So that was the choice of the site. And it said, according to Josephus, the combined forces of these cities amounted to 300,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, 20,000 war chariots. It just seems impossible. Impossible odds. Does this feel familiar? Does this seem familiar? Is this a familiar story for us today? These were impossible odds, but God seems to have a way of overcoming the impossible, doesn't he? Amen. It would be the equivalent in our language to say they had multiple modern warplanes and missiles. These people had the best weapons of war. And it's interesting to me that here again in verse 6, God again looks to Joshua, and it says this in verse 6. The Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid of them, for at this time tomorrow I will cause all of them to be killed before Israel. Don't be afraid. It's amazing to me that this is like a repeating theme throughout this book, that God is saying to Joshua, look, trust me. Don't be afraid. Have courage. I am with you. This is a new thing. You haven't seen this, but trust me. And it's interesting at this point, we don't see Joshua we don't even see a hint of a flinch in this story. Joshua doesn't even, in fact, Joshua goes on the offensive. You imagine that? It's interesting because you look, when I first read this text, you might think that what is said is that God tells Joshua to use a battle tactic, which is to go and lame the horses and burn the chariots. But in fact, when you read it, that's not what happened. It says that they surprised these armies and they overwhelmed them. Then he burned the chariots and lamed the horses. So Joshua, in the face of what seems to be impossible odds, goes on the offensive and surprises this army that's waiting to attack. They don't expect that he's coming. And he has a great victory. Now I want to switch gears for a minute. Because this, again, happens repeatedly. We see God telling Joshua, don't be afraid, trust me. They do, and when they do, they're victorious. But what struck me about this story was, I think, probably because it struck something inside of me. Here was a city, strong, long history, had everything probably people could have wanted in that period of time. And all of a sudden, everything that they knew were interrupted by God. Their life is interrupted by a band of slaves that came out of another dominant kingdom that was being led by a God who now challenges everything they know. Everything they'd built, everything they had. And their response to the interruption of God is, not in my kingdom. You can almost hear the words of this King Jabin as he's planning to send out this message and say, no, we're the last stand. This ain't happening in my kingdom. I don't care what happened down in the south. Not in my kingdom. And that's my title of this message. Not in my kingdom. God interrupts human history. And humanity in this story steps back and says, we don't want it. No. We don't want your interruption. In fact, Your interruption, God, threatens our freedom and our survival. Now, it's easy to look at this and read this text and think, well, God is just taking here. God is in the taking mode. But we have to remember that God is never acting outside of the scope of world redemption. God didn't come at some point and say, okay, well, now I'm going to redeem the world. That was always his plan. So all of this is happening in the context of God's plan to redeem the world. He didn't change his mind at some point. In fact, if you go back to Genesis chapter 12, and he's talking with Abraham, and he says to Abraham, all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So even from then, and even as we know, the word speaks of Yeshua, and it says that he was the lamb that was slain from the foundations of the world. This was always God's intention, but there seems to be some disconnect here. What's going on? God, why are you... But I think the disconnect is not in God's side. It's in humanity's side. It's in how humanity is responding to God's interruption. In fact, in my opinion, the things that God was doing through the people of Israel, the miracles and the things that he did, should have driven these nations to say, okay, your God is God. We surrender ourselves. And in fact, we see that in the story of Rahab, right? Let me read you what Rahab says in Joshua chapter 2. Listen to this. I know the Lord has given you this land. This is Joshua chapter 2, verse 9. This is the words of Rahab. I know the Lord has given you this land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and everyone who lives in this land is panicking because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two Amorite kings, you completely destroyed across the Jordan. When we heard this, we lost heart, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God, listen to this, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now please swear to me by the Lord that you will also show kindness to me and my family. And they promised to have mercy on her and her family. God's miracles were intended to drive the nations to this. Your God is God. We surrender. We'll follow you. But that's not the case. Because our tendency as human beings is when God steps into our history, we push back. And that's what we see here. The people of these nations push back, not in my kingdom. In fact, it's interesting that Rahab ends up becoming the mother of Boaz. So not only is she spared, but she's actually blessed. What would her life have been if God hadn't interrupted? Do you ever ask yourself that question? What was her life before? What would her life have been but that God stepped into her world and she said, okay, your God is God. I'll go with that. Her life went from one place to the other. This is what, unfortunately, humanity doesn't understand, is God wants to take us from that place to this place. But when we push back and say, no, we don't want, not in my kingdom, then God has no choice but to say, okay. Read a commentary from Matthew Henry. It said this: are we stronger than God? Observe here that hardness of heart is the ruin of sinners. Let me read that again. Observe here that the hardness of heart is the ruin of sinners. I just want to bring to light that when I was reading these passages and I was thinking through this and just seeking the Lord, I realized that this recurs over and over and over and over throughout the scriptures. And I was brought to the story of Yeshua. God again steps into human history, comes to earth as a man. And we read in the gospel account of Matthew in chapter 2, what does King Herod do? Not in my kingdom. Not in my kingdom. And he tries to trick the wise men that come to see this king. And obviously they don't fall for it and they leave a different way. But he ends up to try and accomplish his purpose, killing all of the children, the young boys under 2 years old, in all of the region around Bethlehem, because something was threatening his kingdom. We see it again as Yeshua gets into his ministry. And he begins to challenge the things that had been built throughout centuries. And the people say, and the leaders say, no, not in our kingdom. That ain't happening. And they begin to conspire to kill him. Not in my kingdom. And it says this in Luke 22. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to put him to death because they were afraid of the people. And it says, then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, who was numbered with the 12. And he went away and he discussed with the chief priests and the temple police how he could hand him over to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him silver. So here again, God steps into the world in an interruption of everything that they had known at that time. And the response is, no, we don't want this. Not in my kingdom. Isn't that amazing? But I think we all know in our hearts that's our tendency. If we're honest with ourselves, if I'm honest with myself, I know that my tendency is just to kind of react. I have children. How many have ever been interrupted? Now, are interruptions ever generally welcome? I think the reality is it depends on how you look at the interruption. It's how you look at what's coming at you. If it's you're bothering me, you're taking me away from what I need to accomplish, what I need to do, then yes, it's a bother. But when my little kids come to me, Daddy, will you play with me, please? And it's an interruption. I don't know, there's something in me that melts. And I have a hard time actually doing my work because I want to play with them. And I view that interruption as welcome. And I think that's kind of the story here is, do we view God's interruptions of our story, of our history, of our life as welcome, or do we view them as, you're just bothering me, leave me alone, God. Just leave me alone. I want to just come back to one point. I want to ask the question, why did Joshua hamstring the horses and burn the chariots after the battle? This would have seemed like, Joshua, come on, man. Like, we could use this. This is military hardware. Come on. This is not smart. Horses, we could use them. Chariots, we could use them. Why? Why did you do this? And I believe it's this. And let me read you a quote I saw from Darby. God will in no wise allow the world's seat of power to become that of his people, for his people depend exclusively on him. The natural consequence of taking Hatzor would have been to make it the seat of government and a center of influence in the government of God, so that this city should be that for God which it had been before for the world. For before time, it was the head of all those kingdoms. But it was just the contrary. It was totally destroyed. God will not leave a vestige of former power. He will make all things new. The center and the source of power must be his, entirely and exclusively his. A very important lesson for his children if they would preserve their spiritual integrity. He was obedient. God told him to do it. And it went against human wisdom. But the reason why God told him to do it is because I don't want you to become dependent. If you remember our worship leader tonight, Yuri said, some trust in chariots, Some trust in horses. And God said, no, you're never going to be dependent upon chariots and horses. You're going to depend on me. You are going to be dependent, and you're going to live in my kingdom. That's why. Just kind of to bring things down to a close tonight. Remember, we imagined the city. Again, I have to imagine thousands, tens of thousands of people living their everyday life, doing business, raising families, putting their trust and hope in the things that they built. And all of a sudden, all of that is interrupted again by God and this people of Israel and coming through the land. And the reality is that their kingdom failed them. Everything that they had placed their hope and trust in, their strength, their wealth, their power, their military, failed. And nothing was left. And this is the reality for our world today. If you are putting your faith and your hope and your trust in the things that you are building with your own strength, with your own sweat, with your own labor, and not putting your faith and trust in the Lord, your kingdom will fail you. And we see it today in the world around us. We see people who their lives are in shambles and they say, my kingdom has failed me. In fact, it's interesting to me to hear the language in our world and how it comes across again, not in my kingdom. Let me just read you a few quotes. People would say, well, God would say marriage is only between a man and a woman. Some would say, not in my kingdom. Hear it? Not in my kingdom. Some would say, well, God says there's only two sexes, a man and a woman. And some people would say, not in my kingdom. Some would say there's only one way to God, through Yeshua. Not in my kingdom. The one that really struck me was there was a personality in the United States that recently said that it's crazy to think that God could actually speak to people through prayer. Did you hear that? In essence, not in my kingdom. That's crazy in my kingdom. God don't speak to people. Well, I'm sorry, in God's kingdom, he does. And that's the kingdom we're in. So we see these parallels that come back through history, come back through time. But I want to read you this last passage from Revelation chapter 11, verse 15. Listen to this. The seventh angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. I'm here to tell you something tonight. There is a kingdom that will never fail you. The question is, are you going to push back and say, not in my kingdom? Like these people in this city? Or are we going to have the heart like Rahab and say, I realize that God, you are God. I'm thankful. And I'm sure you are. I am thankful that God interrupted my life. Are you thankful tonight that God interrupted your life? Are you thankful that he continues to interrupt your life with his kingdom, with his truth? And I think that's what we carry to the world, is don't look at God's interruption into your world as something that just is there to drive you nuts. God's interruption into your world is his grace to save you. He loves you. He is stepping in because he wants to see you live in a kingdom that will not fail. And that's our prayer tonight. And that's our hope, that God will use us as his vessels to go out into the world, to be his light, to tell the world, listen, this thing that you're pushing back against, this thing that you're so angst against is actually for your good.